You have to understand, some legacies are not meant to continue. They are whispered about in county records, muttered in the shadows of churches, and sometimes buried under layers of family denial. But every so often, one emerges, a lineage so twisted, so isolated, so meticulously folded in on itself, that it produces someone who seems almost impossible to exist. Imagine a child born not of nature's plan, but of compulsion, secrecy, and obsession. A child who carries the weight of generations of closed doors and hushed warnings. This is not a story of triumph. It is a story of inevitability, of a family whose roots were so entangled that every branch bore the mark of the last. And from that darkness, an heir was born, one whose very existence challenges the fragile boundaries we cling to between normalcy and something far more unsettling. The family in question lived in the heart of America, in a county where everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew anything. They were farmers, merchants, ministers, ordinary faces in the crowd, yet behind closed shutters and locked doors, their history was something entirely different. Each marriage, each connection had been drawn like lines on a map, tracing an almost obsessive pattern of sameness, blood recycled again and again. Outsiders spoke little of them, except in warnings, in half-spoken fears that disappeared when curiosity drew closer. Their story was, on the surface, mundane: fields tilled, churches attended, debts paid. But beneath the surface lay a calculus of heredity no one dared quantify. And then he appeared. He was born in the dead of winter, when the sun barely touched the horizon and the wind carried an edge of frost that seemed too sharp for the season. The midwife who delivered him later refused to speak of what she saw, and the family never allowed visitors near the room. Yet it was clear, even then, that this child was different. There was a heaviness in the air around him, a sense that he carried more than just his own small frame. He carried the echo of generations, a lineage so tightly wounded it could no longer hide. To anyone who encountered him as he grew, it was like meeting the culmination of a secret experiment that had been decades in the making, a living, breathing heir to a legacy no one else could endure. They tried, of course, to protect him. They sheltered him, educated him, tried to mold him into the shape society expected. But nature has its own cruel sense of irony. The very inbreeding that haunted his ancestry had given him traits, sharpness, endurance, cunning, that made him almost otherworldly in comparison to his peers. It was not a gift. It was a trap. He inherited everything the family had hoarded in silence: the physical markers, the mental quirks, the emotional scars stitched into the very DNA of the household. And so, as he began to walk among the other children of the town, there was an undercurrent of unease. Even the adults, those hardened by decades of rural life, sensed it, that some secrets, no matter how long buried, refused to stay hidden. No one would have guessed, not then, how far the legacy would stretch through him. To understand him, one must first trace the web that preceded him. The marriages, the unions, the quiet obsession with keeping the bloodline contained. Each thread of this web is a story in itself, a haunting testament to a family unwilling to let the world touch their own. And from that darkness, an impossible heir emerges, carrying within him the full weight of a legacy no one wanted to see. To truly grasp the weight of what this child carried, you have to go back, not decades, but generations. Back to the earliest ancestors who first chose control over chance. They were not evil in the way newspapers sensationalized the word. They were cautious, rigid, and obsessed with continuity, convinced that the strength of their family lay not in expansion, but in isolation. Each generation became more insular, more vigilant. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for preservation. Cousins, second cousins, even more distant relations, all meticulously selected to maintain the genetic thread, to avoid the unpredictability of strangers. It was a subtle form of violence, quieter than swords or fire, yet no less destructive. The community around them whispered in fragments, children born with unusual features, minds that didn't quite fit, a mother or father who spoke in riddles about the line and the gift. Nobody dared confront them. Curiosity in such a place was dangerous. Asking questions could make you the subject of suspicion. And so the family thrived in secrecy, their legacy preserved in the shadows of ordinary life. Theirs was a theater of careful appearances, the same greetings at church, the same polite nods to neighbors, the same dinners around worn wooden tables. Everything outwardly normal, but behind closed doors, patterns repeated themselves over and over until the repetition became a kind of obsession. And then came the anomalies. For every generation, there were children who did not survive, or who were quietly removed from public view, or who displayed traits that frightened even their own parents. This was the price of keeping bloodlines pure, of avoiding the intrusion of the outside. The family did not record these failures openly, but if you dig into the probate records, the church ledgers, the diaries that were never meant to be read, a pattern emerges. Each generation was a controlled experiment, measured in traits, behaviors, and physical characteristics. Every success reinforced their conviction that they were destined to create something, someone, who could embody the entirety of their vision. By the time the heir in question was born, the family's obsession had reached a fever pitch. They had survived epidemics, financial crises, and the slow erosion of small-town society, yet they remained unbroken, unyielding. Every whisper of scandal had been absorbed, every shame carefully folded back into the walls of the home. And when this child was delivered, it was not just another birth. It was the culmination of decades of calculation and compulsion. The town may have seen a boy, but the family saw the embodiment of their entire lineage. A living ledger of mistakes, triumphs, and genetic consequences all bundled into a single, impossibly fragile human. Even those closest to him sensed something uncanny. Visitors to the home later described an air of heaviness, an almost tangible tension, as if the house itself were aware of the significance of his presence. And yet, for the outside world, nothing had changed. He played with other children, he learned to read, he grew slow but steady. The horror was not in immediate recognition. It was in the realization years later that the world had unknowingly witnessed the creation of something that, by all natural rules, should not have existed. The impossible heir had arrived, and with him, the Legacies' shadow stretched long and dark. The child's early years were deceptively ordinary. He laughed, he cried, he stumbled across the rough planks of the farmhouse floor just like any other boy. But there was a quiet intensity about him, something that drew attention without inviting it. Teachers noted his curiosity, neighbors remarked on his strange precociousness, and even his siblings, those who had grown up immersed in the same family obsession, felt a subtle unease around him. He seemed to absorb the world differently, not just noticing what others overlooked, but sensing what they could not. There was a shadow inside him, a reflection of generations that had been carefully hidden, and it clung to him like a second skin. Physically, he was remarkable, though not always in ways that comforted those around him. His features were sharp, almost severe, yet familiar in a way that unnerved outsiders. His eyes seemed to carry the weight of someone who had lived longer than a single lifetime, and those who caught their gaze felt a strange recognition, as if the child were both stranger and ancestor at once. Doctors who examined him spoke in careful tones, noting unusual combinations of traits, subtle anomalies that were by themselves harmless, but combined hinted at a history too tightly wound to be fully natural. There was brilliance, but also fragility. Strength, but also the persistent echo of genetic tension that had haunted his family for decades. His family, of course, was intensely protective. They raised him with vigilance bordering on obsession, carefully curating what he saw, who he met, even what books he read. Outsiders were kept at arm's length, friendships were allowed, but always under supervision. And in those quiet hours, the child became a mirror to the family's own history. He repeated phrases they had long used, mimicked habits that had been drilled into generations, and absorbed the unspoken rules of the household. But there was also resistance. A spark that was undeniably his own, a defiance that sometimes frightened even his parents. It was as though the impossible heir was aware, even in those early years, that he had been created to carry a weight that was neither fair nor natural. As he grew, the strain of his inheritance became more apparent. Childhood illnesses were more frequent, recoveries slower. He displayed moments of brilliance, but also episodes of intense withdrawal, staring into nothing with a focus that seemed almost predatory. Family members whispered about the line when he was out of earshot, acknowledging in hushed tones that he was both their greatest hope and their deepest curse. The local community, too, began to notice small, unsettling details: the way he moved, the intensity of his gaze, the quiet authority he seemed to command even before puberty. It was never said outright, but an invisible tension settled over him, a recognition that he was the culmination of a family secret no one dared confront. By the time he reached adolescence, it became impossible to ignore the truth. He was no longer just a child. He was a living repository of generations of obsession, isolation, and control. Every movement, every gesture, every glance carried echoes of a past that most of the town had forgotten, or chosen to forget, and with that realization came a subtle, growing horror. The impossible heir was not merely a boy. He was a warning, a reminder that some family legacies cannot be contained, that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to die quietly. Adolescence brought a transformation that the family both anticipated and feared. The boy, now growing into a man, carried the cumulative weight of generations in ways that were impossible to ignore. His body was strong, unnervingly so, yet his movements were often awkward, as if he were negotiating a frame shaped by both careful design and genetic misfortune. His mind, sharp beyond measure, absorbed information like a sponge, yet it was also haunted by a persistent restlessness, a sense that he was caught between two realities, one of ordinary human life and another of relentless familial compulsion. The family's secrecy, which had always been a protective measure, began to feel more like a prison. Every interaction outside the household became a calculated risk. Friends were selected and observed, questions were deflected or silenced. And yet, the boy, this impossible heir, had begun to notice the pattern. He sensed the meticulous care that had gone into shaping him, and he began to question the very motives of the people who had raised him. It was subtle at first, lingering looks, small acts of defiance. But gradually it became impossible to deny. The family's obsession had not been about love, nor even about survival. It had been about control, about creating someone who could carry the entire weight of a hidden, shameful legacy. School became a battleground of sorts. He excelled in some areas, struggling in others. Teachers were baffled by his brilliance, yet uneasy about his intensity. Peers were drawn to him, yet instinctively wary. It was as though the impossible heir carried with him an invisible aura, a signal of otherness that could not be suppressed. And in his private moments, he would stare at his own reflection, tracing the lines of a face that felt both familiar and alien, a face shaped by decades of inbreeding, yet animated by an intelligence and awareness that no one had anticipated. At home, the tension grew more palpable. Family gatherings, once ordinary rituals, became exercises in careful monitoring, a constant negotiation of presence and absence. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carried with it the weight of expectation. The boy's parents and elders watched him with a combination of pride and dread. He was the living proof of their painstaking work, yet the closer he came to adulthood, the more uncontrollable he seemed. They had created a vessel for their legacy, but the vessel had begun to assert its own will. It was in these years that whispers began to circulate in the surrounding community, quiet observations from neighbors who had long suspected something unusual about the family. They spoke of the boy's unnerving focus, the intensity of his stare, the way he seemed to move through the world with a sense of purpose far beyond his years. And yet, these were not the things that haunted the family most. What terrified them was the knowledge that their secrets were no longer safely confined. The impossible heir had begun to see them, to understand them, and in that understanding lay a potential for upheaval that no one had anticipated. By the time he reached late adolescence, the impossible heir had become something more than human, or at least more than the family had intended. The very traits that had been cultivated over generations now converged in a way that was uncanny, even terrifying. His mind was razor-sharp, capable of dissecting motives and predicting actions with eerie precision. His body, though shaped by decades of closed lineage, moved with an almost preternatural strength. And yet, there was a darkness beneath it all, a lingering tension in every gesture, a weight in every glance, as if the past itself clung to him like a second skin. The community, which had long ignored or whispered about the family's strange insularity, began to notice things that could not be easily dismissed. Children would avoid him instinctively. Animals seemed uneasy in his presence, even adults, people accustomed to rural life, to the unpredictability of farm and forest, felt a subtle apprehension when he was near. It was not fear of violence exactly, but a deeper, more primal recognition that something fundamental had shifted. He was the product of a family secret so thoroughly buried that even time could not erase it, and now he was stepping into the world with a presence that could not be contained. Inside the family home, the elders began to realize the truth. They had created a vessel, but the vessel was no longer theirs to control. The boy, now nearly a man, had begun to act with an autonomy that was impossible to ignore. He questioned their instructions, challenged their long-held rules, and observed the patterns of the family with a clarity that was almost surgical. In the quiet of the house, whispers of the line grew urgent. What had once been a source of pride, the preservation of their blood, the careful orchestration of traits over generations, had become something that frightened even them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? It was around this time that the impossible heir began to display behaviors that could only be described as adaptive, almost predatory. He understood, in ways that no one else could, the unspoken vulnerabilities of those around him. He saw patterns of human behavior as a weaver sees threads, recognizing weak points, emotional fissures, and points of control. And yet, he also struggled with the weight of inheritance. It was a burden that no human should bear, a lifetime of expectation, secrecy, and psychological gravity compressed into a single body and mind. Every glance at a family portrait, every reading of an old diary, every whispered warning echoed in him like a drumbeat he could neither ignore nor escape. The story that follows is not one of triumph, nor even survival in the traditional sense. It is a story of the psychological consequences of obsessive lineage, of what happens when a family sacrifices humanity for the sake of continuity. And as he moved from adolescence into the threshold of adulthood, it became clear that the impossible heir was no longer simply a product of inbreeding, but a living record of generations of secrecy, obsession, and unspoken horror. He had inherited everything: the brilliance, the fragility, the shadow of family history, and now he had to exist in a world that was wholly unprepared to receive him. Adulthood arrived like a storm, silent at first, then impossible to ignore. The impossible heir was no longer just a curiosity or a subject of whispered fears. He had become the embodiment of a family's dark obsession, a living archive of decades of inbreeding, secrecy, and control. Every movement, every decision carried the weight of generations that had tried and failed to contain him. His presence alone seemed to bend the reality of the household. Family members moved through their own home as though navigating a terrain they no longer recognized, uncertain where control ended and inevitability began. The psychological strain, both his and theirs, became almost unbearable. Childhood patterns had calcified into adult instincts, and yet there was no relief. He understood too much, remembered too much, and sensed every subtle undercurrent of family expectation with unnerving clarity. Even the elders, the ones who had orchestrated decades of careful lineage, found themselves silenced by the realization that their creation was beyond their mastery. The impossible heir did not obey out of fear or respect. He simply existed, an unyielding monument to what had been done, what had been sacrificed, and what had been demanded. Outside the walls of the family home, the world noticed only fragments of what he was. Locals reported odd coincidences, unexplained insights, and a presence that seemed to carry memory and weight far beyond his years. He moved through towns, through communities, and through encounters as though he were simultaneously a resident and an observer of every secret ever kept. Friends, strangers, and even casual acquaintances were affected by his attention. People would leave conversations shaken, feeling as if they had glimpsed something forbidden, something that should not be seen. And yet, to the world at large, he remained ostensibly ordinary, just another face in a crowd, carrying his secret like a shadow no one could name. The house itself, the locus of the family's centuries-long obsession, seemed to respond to him. Rooms felt smaller, the air heavier, and objects seemed to accumulate subtle layers of tension. He could sit in a chair for hours, reading a ledger, a diary, or a letter, and emerge with an understanding that others might spend a lifetime pursuing. This knowledge was not always comforting. He inherited the family's guilt, its shame, its compulsions, and its silent horrors. And with that inheritance came the realization that he was not merely living history. He was history, condensed into a single body, a single consciousness, a single impossible heir. And yet, there was an unsettling question that lingered over him unspoken but always present. What does one do with the knowledge of such a legacy? Can it be carried without breaking? Can it be acknowledged without repeating? The impossible heir had become a psychological repository, a testament to human obsession and isolation, and a warning of what happens when lineage, secrecy, and control collide in a way that defies natural expectation. It was not only a horror of the body or the mind, it was a horror of inevitability, the undeniable weight of a past that refuses to let go. In time, the impossible heir came to realize the full scope of what he represented. He was not just an individual, he was the sum of a family's hidden fears, ambitions, and compulsions, a living ledger of choices made in shadows. Every feature, every instinct, every skill he possessed was the result of decades, centuries in a sense, of obsession. And yet, for all the control and calculation, there remained a singular truth: he was unpredictable. The family had tried to shape him, mold him, contain him, but no matter how meticulous their designs, he had grown beyond them. The heir was the proof that legacy is both fragile and inexorably powerful, that the past cannot simply be buried or sanitized, and that even inbreeding, secrecy, and obsession cannot fully dictate the future. He carried the weight of the lineage with a quiet, haunting resolve. Each day was a negotiation between the inherited past and the life he might forge for himself. The townspeople, long accustomed to whispers and unease, could only speculate about his nature, never fully understanding the depth of what lingered beneath his calm exterior. And yet, the family itself, those who had orchestrated every generation before him, were left to confront a truth they had long avoided: that their legacy, their careful preservation of blood, had created something alive, aware, and beyond their control. The psychological impact was profound, both on him and on those around him. Even those who loved him, or thought they did, found themselves grappling with a presence that was both familiar and alien. The impossible heir could evoke empathy, admiration, fear, and discomfort, often simultaneously. He was a mirror in which the family and even the community could see their own complicity in the secrecy and obsession that had defined them. And in that reflection there was no escape, no forgiveness, only recognition of the weight carried silently for generations. And yet, in the quietest moments, there was a kind of haunting beauty to his existence. He embodied the persistence of life in its most extreme form, a life that refuses to be contained, that refuses to be sanitized or erased. The impossible heir was both a warning and a testament that family, legacy, and history are forces more powerful than any single individual, yet also forces that can never fully dictate who we become. He was the final, inescapable chapter of a story that had been written in silence, and now, finally, it could be seen. This is the story of a lineage folded in on itself, a family secret carried through decades, and a child born into the impossible task of embodying it all. It is a story of obsession, of isolation, and of inheritance that defies nature. And in the shadows of small towns, behind the closed doors of ordinary homes, such stories always linger. They are warnings, whispered too late for those who dare to uncover them. Some legacies are not meant to be continued, and yet, against all odds, they find a way to live on. The impossible heir exists, and through him, the weight of history refuses to die quietly.